Bonjour, friends! My name is Swag Kirby, and today I'm going to be showing off my Game Boy and Game Boy Advance game collection. I'm so excited. As a kid, I grew up with the Game Boy. I got a Game Boy Color for my 4th birthday, but I didn't really become like a true gamer until the Game Boy Advance era. So the Game Boy systems have like a very special place in my heart. So these are my systems themselves. I showed most of them off in another video, but we have this one, which I have got in the time since. It's the original Game Boy Advance. I've actually never owned an original Game Boy Advance before. Only I grew up with the SP, so this is my first time using it. And then this is the e-reader for the Game Boy Advance. If you don't know what the e-reader is, it is a device which scans certain cards that work for certain games. Unfortunately, it didn't catch on, so a lot of e-reader stuff was Japan exclusive. But right now I'm going to show you all of my Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games. Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. Starting with the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Okay, so first up we have a Japanese copy of Pokemon de Panipon, or Pokemon Puzzle Challenge in English. I did have the English version of this years ago, but unfortunately it was lost to time. However, I do have the English version on a 3DS Virtual Console. It's like it's basically Panel de Pon, but with Pokemon, and unlike Pokemon Puzzle League, which is a localized reskin, this game was a Pokemon Panel de Pon game, like, right from the start. It has Panel de Pon's, like, cute aesthetic, so I really like that. And next up, we have Winnie the Pooh, Adventures in the 100-Acre Wood. And if you don't know, this was the very first Nintendo game I ever owned. This is nowhere near my original copy. Like, I got this at a used game store like a month ago. I remember, like, getting not far in it. I just remember, like, running around Pooh's house, just, like, pacing around Pooh's house and not knowing you could go outside. And next up is Super Mario Bros. Deluxe. Now, this game is sort of the precursor to the Super Mario Advance series, which will be covered later. And it's sort of like an enhanced port of Super Mario Bros. For the NES, but it has like a whole bunch of other features too, like a calendar and several new modes. So that's pretty cool. I have this one on Virtual Console as well. And next up, we have Pokemon Crystal in both English and Japanese. I did a playthrough of the English version of Pokemon Crystal, but unfortunately the save file got corrupted, so everything that I accomplished there is lost. But something that's cool that I kind of wish the English version had, like the Japanese cartridge had this cool little like Suicune symbol, so it's unfortunately that this one didn't have it too. And then next up is Kirby Tilt and Tumble. It's also in Japanese because the English version is expensive as shit. Japanese games are surprisingly common. This is probably the hardest Kirby game because, like, you move the system to make Kirby roll around, and it can be very frustrating at times. I played most of it via Nintendo Switch Online, but here it is on the original Game Boy Color. It's cute. Cartridge is pink. I like that. Next up, we have the Japanese Gold and Silver games. So I have the entirety of the second generation of Pokemon in Japanese, of the second main series mainline games, and I guess I have this too. I don't have the Pokemon TCG Here Comes GR because that is very, very expensive. Next up is Donkey Kong Country. This is sort of, I don't know where I got this, I just remember I just randomly found it one day, and it's sort of like so this one is a port of Donkey Kong Country on SNES, and then the later two Donkey Kong Country games I know got ported to Game Boy Advance. And then Pokemon Pinball. We all know Pokemon Pinball with the iconic Rumble Pack. Does this need a new battery? Yeah, this needs a new battery. Holy shit, that's kind of disgusting. Okay, yeah, it's been a while since I played this, but Pokemon Pinball is a really fun game. I always liked the series, and I really hope they add this one to Nintendo Switch Online. Next up, we have Pokemon Yellow, Special Pikachu Edition. I've had this one for a while. Basically, and here's the Japanese one, which I got recently. Unfortunately, the Japanese one doesn't work. It needs to be fixed. But, yeah, so, like, Pokemon Yellow. We all know Pokemon Yellow. I actually started a playthrough of Pokemon Yellow on stream, but unfortunately no one watched, so I just, like, abandoned it. I might start it in the future. And next we have the Japanese version of Kirby's Block Ball, which is one of my... and the English version, too. I got the English version recently. Kirby's Block Ball is one of my favorite Kirby spin-offs, and I did a playthrough of it on stream recently, the Japanese version, because I hadn't gotten the English version yet. And next is Kirby's Dream Land 2, which is... which I also have in Japanese. I think that's pretty... I collect games in both English and Japanese, so yeah. Speaking of games in both English and Japanese, here is Tetris Attack and the Japanese version, Yoshi no Panepon. So, if you don't know, Panel de Pon for the SNES was localized into Tetris Attack, which eventually got a Game Boy port. And then that Game Boy port was localized into Yoshi no Panepon, which I thought was pretty interesting. And in terms of the 3DS, that version made it to the Japanese eShop, but not the American eShop, because it used the Tetris name and their Tetris license expired. But it's cool that I have this game in both of the languages. Next up, it's Pokemon, the trading card game for Game Boy. I seriously thought this was the sequel, but it's not. The sequel is, like, super expensive. The sequel never got released outside Japan. So, yeah. So I have this in Japanese, and then the English version I have on the 3DS Virtual Console and Nintendo Switch Online. And next is Kirby's Pinball Land. I never really got far in this game. I have it on the 3DS again, but I never got, like, super far into it. Excuse me. But it's an alright game. I think the Brawl Ball from Kirby Mass Attack was better. But it's good. It's got a good soundtrack. And next is Super Mario Land 2, the 6 Golden Coins. The first appearance of Wario. Like the Donkey Kong Country one, I don't know where this came from. It just randomly popped up, and now I have it, and I think that's pretty cool. I always like collecting more things. And then Kirby's Dream Land, which is Kirby's grand debut on the Game Boy. As you can see, he is white and not pink because the localizers didn't really know what to do. So that's an interesting little bit of trivia. And next up, it's Pokemon Red and Green, the OG Pokemon games, which are surprisingly cheap for some reason. So this makes Pokemon Blue the only core series Pokemon game I don't have in Japanese, so that's pretty interesting. And the next one is Tetris. I remember when I was 7 years old, I randomly found this Tetris in a drawer. I think it was my dad's, I'm not sure. But basically, it's Tetris. It's good old Tetris. Everyone knows Tetris. It's the game that put the Game Boy on the map. And lastly, this is a copy that I thought was Pokemon Green. I got it at New York Comic Con a few years back, but it ended up being a Bomberman game. So I felt like I was kind of scammed, but it's interesting that I have a Bomberman game. I eventually got Pokemon Green on eBay, which was surprisingly cheap. So, and now on to the Game Boy Advance games. Obviously, when we think of the Game Boy, we think of Pokemon. So here is Emerald, Fire Red, Leaf Green, and Sapphire. As you can see, they don't have, most of them don't have labels on them because you could tell what they are by their colors. These, unfortunately, are not my original copies that I had from my childhood. I got these, like, years later. The Sapphire one, I actually started a new game, and I did a playthrough on stream, which was one of my favorite playthroughs to do. And Leaf Green I also did a playthrough of recently, but I did it off stream because I didn't have the Game Boy adapter yet. And next it's Pokemon Pinball Ruby and Sapphire, which is another, not my original childhood copy, but still a great game, and like the other one, I hope this one comes to Nintendo Switch Online. Next up we have the Classic NES series, or Classic Famicom series in Japan. Basically for the 20th anniversary of the Famicom and the NES, they basically just ported a bunch of NES games to Game Boy Advance. They don't look the best, like Mario's all scrunched up, but I think they're pretty cool. They're a pretty cool novelty. Donkey Kong and Ice Climber were the ones I had as a kid, but I unfortunately lost those copies, so I got these recently. And next up, speaking of Mario, we have the Super Mario Advance series. Super Mario Advance, Super Mario Advance 2, Super Mario Advance 4 and 3. I don't know why I ordered them like that, but here they are. Super Mario Advance was the first Mario game I ever owned, and unlike a lot of the other games, this is actually my childhood copy. I don't know how it managed to survive this long, but here it is. And if you combine these with the NES and Famicom classics, you could play Mario's entire, original 2D lineage on the Game Boy Advance, which I think is pretty cool. And, back then, it was a big deal because, console games on a portable system was, mind-blowing at the time. Nowadays, we have the Switch and the 3DS and all that. And next up, we have Kirby! Hooray! Kirby only had 2 games on the Game Boy Advance. Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland, which for a lot of people is the only Kirby game they ever played. It's a remake of Kirby's Adventure. And Kirby the Amazing Mirror, which is the only, non-linear Kirby game, which I think is interesting. I also have a boxed copy of Nightmare in Dreamland, which I think is pretty cool. As you can see, it came out in America the same time as Right Back At Ya did, so they were cross-promoting it with the show. You could even see it says Right Back At Ya. But anyway, yeah, Kirby had some pretty good stuff on the Game Boy Advance. It's sad that I didn't have more, and I think Nightmare in Dreamland is the reason Kirby's Adventure didn't get a NES Classics port, but it's pretty cool that it got a remake. I think the 3D Classics version is better, but anyway, here is WarioWare, the original WarioWare, and WarioWare Twisted, another series that made its debut on the Game Boy Advance. WarioWare became one of my favorite franchises. I didn't like the new one, but WarioWare is really addicting and really fun. And speaking of series that got their start on the Game Boy Advance, it's Rhythm Tengoku, the original Japanese version of Rhythm Heaven that never got localized. Yeah, I managed to get this one on Amazon, surprisingly. And since there's not really much, dialogue, really all you do is, rhythm beats, it's, pretty easy to complete if you can't really read Japanese, since there's, very few words. And next is the Pac-Man Collection and Namco Museum. Now, Namco Museum is the only other game that I have, from my childhood. The Pac-Man Collection I got recently. Basically what these are, they're a bunch of ports of Pac-Man and some other Namco games. Miss Pac-Man was ported to Namco Museum, and as we all know, they lost Miss Pac-Man in a lawsuit and they can't use her anymore. So it's pretty cool that we have this, and I'm surprised I have it all these years later. And lastly, we have Mario Party Advance, which I just got given to me. And Game & Watch Gallery 4, which apparently never released in Japan until the Wii U Virtual Console came out, which I thought was pretty interesting. So I'm wondering if they're going to release that in for Nintendo Switch Online, because they released the 3rd Game & Watch Gallery before all the others. I don't know why, but they did. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little trip down memory lane. If you like this content, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the future with another video.